want realism, I want magic.
Magic.
Yes, magic. I try to give that to people. I do misrepresent things. I don't tell truth. I tell what ought to be truth, and if that is sinful, then let me be punished for it. Don't turn the light on. Hey, Stella! Deliberate cruelty is not forgivable.
You know, I've been on to you from the start, and not once did you pull the wool over this boy's eyes.
We're talking about his desire. Just brutal desire. The name of that rattle-trap streetcar that bangs through the quarter. Haven't you ever ridden on that streetcar?
And you are the queen of the Nile, sitting on your throne, swilling down my liquor. You know what I say? Ha ha!
I stayed at a hotel called the Tarantula Arms.
Tarantula Arms?
Yes, a big spider. That's why I brought my victims.
I've always depended on the kindness of strangers.
Hello, I'm film historian Tony Maeda.
And I'm Brad Shreve, who's just a guy who likes movies.
We discuss movies and television from Hollywood's golden age. We go behind the scenes and share our opinions, too.
And of course, being the average guy, my opinions are the ones that matter.
As does your self-delusion. Welcome to Going Hollywood.
Tony, I want to start out this episode a little differently than we normally do.
Okay, go ahead.
Normally we put off me giving the synopsis. I'm going to do it right up front here and tell people what A Streetcar Named Desire is about.
That sounds great.
A Streetcar Named Desire is a classic film about Marlon Brando wearing tight t-shirts. And I am okay with that.
I am not mad about that at all.
In fact, if Marlon was here, he'd say, you know what, Brad, Tony, I understand it. I was pretty turned on, too. What do you think, you're a pair of queens? Would it drive you crazy if I did this for the whole podcast, Brad?
Well, do you want my critique of your accent?
It's not very good.
You sound like the love child of Marlon Brando and Pee Wee Herman.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. I'll stick to Little Edie. It's very funny. But that's. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this movie so many times, and every time I see him in the very first scene, he takes my breath away. Every time. What is it about Brando in that T-shirt, in that gorgeous black and white photography? It is just stunning. I mean, you can understand why he just blew everybody away throughout the world with this. I mean, it's crazy. It's insane. He still does it. That's what's amazing to me.
This launched his career, and it would have been a travesty if it didn't, because he was amazing.
You know, it's funny. Yes, obviously, we're talking about A Streetcar Named Desire for anybody who has not caught on to that by now. Directed by Elia Kazan from 1950, Warner Brothers, also starring a little actress you may have heard of called Vivien Leigh, and Kim Hunter and Karl Malden. The three of them, Brando, Malden, and Hunter, all reprising their Broadway roles. And Vivien Leigh brought in to replace Jessica Tandy, who was the original Blanche DuBois on Broadway.
And I can't wait till we talk about that. I have a few words about that. But anyway, go on.
Do you? I do too. Good, good. I was kind of surprised when you suggested this. This sounds like something I would say, hey, let's do Streetcar. And you go, oh, I've never seen it. But you've seen it, clearly.
Well, Tony, it's not like I don't watch classic films. But the reason I wanted to do this is I remember the movie and loving the film. I don't remember the details. I really didn't remember a lot of the details of the story. But what I did remember is in drama class in high school, we didn't do this play on the stage, but we did read it in class. Mm-hmm. And I fell in love with it. I remember just how much I loved it. And I wanted it to take me back to get that feeling again. And it didn't let me down.
That's amazing. Yeah. I had a similar first experience with Streetcar, that it was the play. And I read the play, and I don't think I have ever been so affected by a play, by reading a play before or since. So much so that I read it. I used to read it once a year, every year. It's the most beautifully written piece of work. And Tennessee Williams just really outdid himself with Streetcar. And then I saw the film. I can't remember the first time I saw the film. It was quite a while ago, but I can remember being knocked out by Brando. But I'm always knocked out by Brando, young Brando. It's just, you can see why he set the world on fire with this. And then it began with the play. You know, he galvanized Broadway with this play. And it wasn't like he came out of nowhere. He had done a few plays on Broadway. And but it was this film, this performance, this character. It's one of those instances where the character and the actor come together, and the effect is so perfect and so startling that it, in this case, changed acting. It changed the way Broadway perceived plays. When the film was made, it changed Hollywood, and the whole style of acting changed because of this performance. Think about that for a minute. I mean, an entire style of acting changed because of this one performance by this one man. Incredible.
It is incredible. And I loved it when he was on. Oh my God, what an awful, awful person. And I heard he didn't like playing this role because Stanley Kowalski was such a horrible person, but you couldn't wait for him to be on the screen because he played it so well.
Yeah, well, he didn't. You're right. He detested Stanley and he fought that he fought that typecasting for the rest of his life. That's why he did so many. I mean, he did Julius Caesar 3 years after this, and he played Mark Antony, and he's done. I mean, he's Brando. He's legendary for all the things he's did, and the way he sang in Guys and Dolls 5 years later. Your eyes are the eyes of a woman in love, and may they gaze evermore until I'm not supposed to sing. I had to do it.
You know what? I don't think the internet spiders will catch that.
They won't catch my Brando
song.
singing from Guys and Dolls.
No.
But yeah, it's funny, you know. In Williams, I'd like to talk a little bit about the play because I think it's important to get the genesis of the play. I'm not going to talk a lot about it. I never do, but it's important to have background. You know, Williams, Tennessee Williams. His first hit in 1945 was The Glass Menagerie, which kind of really put him on the map. Before then, he'd been very much a journeyman writer, always writing. He worked at MGM for a while in the 40s, working on stories, but he could never really catch fire. And then The Glass Menagerie did it. And he wrote Streetcar, and he gave it to his agent, a very famous agent named Audrey Wood. And he said that he based Blanche DuBois on a combination of his aunt, Tallulah Bankhead, but mostly everybody who talks about Tennessee Williams said that Blanche DuBois was based on Tennessee Williams, that he was basically Blanche DuBois, which is kind of funny. If you know anything about Tennessee Williams, it makes sense. So Irene Mayer Selznick was the wife of David O. Selznick, a big producer in Hollywood, produced Gone with the Wind, and the daughter of Louis B. Mayer, so that's quite lineage. And she was starting out her career. She'd left David Selznick, and she was starting out her career as a producer. She had produced another play, which didn't do well, and this play was brought to her attention, and she decided it was her mission to get this play on Broadway. She was a very canny, very sophisticated woman, and she made it her mission to get this taken care of. And she contacted Elia Kazan, who was a director on Broadway. He had directed All My Sons. On film, he had directed Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And she wanted Kazan to do this play. And Kazan was an actor in the group theater. The group theater was basically the precursor to the actor's studio. This is all going somewhere, I guarantee you. I know it seems like I'm going off in tangents, but it all dovetails, okay?
It'll all come around.
It all comes around. It all dovetails with me. So the group theater is the entity that introduced the Stanislavski acting method to the United States. We've talked about this before. What is the method? The method is the Stanislavski method. When we talked about Breakfast at Tiffany's, we talked about George Peppard. He was a method actor. When we say someone's a method actor, it means they were trained in the Stanislavski method, and it was from the group theater. And from the group theater, these people broke off. Lee Strasberg was in the group theater. He broke off, and he became most clearly identified with the method because he taught then at the Actors Studio. He created his own studio. Stella Adler, same thing. Stella Adler had a student at the New School for Social Research in the 40s that she trained, and his name was Marlon Brando. And even then, he set everybody on their asses with his acting. So you have this conglomeration of people all coming around, circling around this project called A Streetcar Named Desire.
I didn't know all that background.
Yeah, and I don't know that you needed to, but I told it anyway.
No, I love hearing your background stories.
It's fascinating to me because there's always a through line. You know, things just don't happen. Brando wasn't just walking down the street one day and walked into a theater and auditioned for this part. They knew who he was. Kazan had seen him on Broadway in one scene in a play called Truckline Cafe. He had one scene and he stopped the show in this one emotional scene. He played an ex-GI who murders his wife, and he just has one scene. So everyone was aware of who Brando was, but Brando, being Brando, was very hard to get a hold of. They could never find him because he didn't have one place where he lived. He kind of went from sofa to sofa to sofa. But they knew they wanted him. So they were eventually able to track him down and talk to him about it. But they had to get the approval of Tennessee Williams. And Tennessee Williams was living upstate at the time. So this is what I love about this story is. So Kazan gave Brando some money and said, go upstate and meet Tennessee Williams and get his okay before we start this play. So he gave Brando this money, and Brando left New York and disappeared for a couple weeks. Nobody knew where he was. Tennessee's like, he's not here. He's not showing up. Well, it turns out he spent all the money that Kazan gave him on God knows what and had to hitchhike to see Williams. But he eventually made it to Tennessee Williams. Tennessee Williams wasn't really sure about Brando for this. And then Brando did something amazing. He fixed Tennessee Williams' plumbing. Tennessee Williams was having plumbing problems. And Brando, I'm sure he took his shirt off.
Well,
took his shirt off, climbed under the sink, and fixed his plumbing. And Williams fell in love with him, of course, and said, "You're my Stanley." So that's how that part got cast, because of Tennessee Williams' plumbing problems.
well, knowing Tennessee Williams, seeing Marlon Brando working on his plumbing, and I'm sure his mind went wild, and he was in.
Yes. So he was Stanley. But you know, the thing about the play is that the play, it's Blanche's story. You know, when we talk about Streetcar Named Desire, we always talk about Brando. I just imitated Brando when we first started talking about it. You said the reason, you said the synopsis was Brando in a t-shirt. It's Blanche's story. And Brad, you should give us a synopsis of it.
It's actually a very simple story. It takes place in the French Quarter, which really surprised me. I didn't realize I knew it was in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never been in New Orleans, but I picture the French Quarter as a big touristy party place. But I guess at that time, or maybe there's bad areas of the French Quarter. At that time, it was a different animal.
It takes place in an area of the French Quarter. Well, the street that they live on, that Stella and Stan live on, is called Elysian Fields. And that's a real street in New Orleans. And as Blanche says, and we can talk more about this later, they told me to take a streetcar named Desire and transfer to one called Cemetery and to get off at the Elysian Fields. Well, that story right there is the story of a streetcar named Desire. You go from Desire to Cemetery to Elysian Fields. What are the Elysian Fields? Are a mythological place where heroes, that was their afterlife in Greek mythology, was Elysian Fields. So you're basically telling you the story of Blanche. But I interrupted you with my little tangent. Go ahead with the synopsis.
That's what you're here for.
To interrupt you.
So Blanche DuBois is a high school teacher who lost her job in Laurel, Mississippi. And we find out it's because she had a fling with a 17-year-old boy. And after that fling, she moves into the Flamingo Hotel in Laurel. And this all takes place this is all before the story begins, but this is how she gets to New Orleans. So in the process of all this, she also loses the family estate, Belle Reve, due to creditors. So she's pretty much down and out, and she moves into the Flamingo Hotel, and she gets this, she's a hussy. She gets this reputation of being a kind of a free-willing gal.
Yeah.
And so out of money, she goes to New Orleans, and she moves in with her sister and her lovely husband, Stanley. And Stanley dislikes and torments Blanche. And he eventually rapes her, but that, I guess that's more prominent in the play. They fade to black in the movie. I didn't even catch for sure that he did that.
Hello, production code. Yeah, we'll talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. At the same time, there's a friend of Stanley's, kind of a card buddy, Mitch, who They fall madly in love with each other. And then Mitch learns about her time at the Flamingo Hotel. And pretty much with everything else, Stanley especially tormenting her, Blanche, who was teetering on the edge to begin with, she is driven to madness.
Yeah.
And that's the story. There really, if you think about it, Tony, there really is no real story here. There's not a traditional...
Like a plot?
Yeah, there's not a traditional plot.
Yeah, like with a... Well, yeah, well, it's basically, as we said, it's Blanche's story, so it's basically the disintegration of this woman and her psyche and her descent into madness. I mean, she's pretty shaky to begin with when she arrives at the Faubourg Marigny, is what the area in New Orleans is called, where they live. And as I said, they live on Elysian Fields. So you kind of get those illusions from her very first entrance that this is a woman who's on the downslide. And on Broadway, the character of Blanche was played by Jessica Tandy, who I'm sure most people know now from Driving Miss Daisy, but this was many years before, obviously. She wasn't quite that old.
Brilliant actress.
When she played Blanche. Yes, a brilliant actress. And of British extraction, by the way. It's kind of funny how both these actresses who were British or had a link to Britain played the ultimate Southern belles. So Blanche DuBois, and for our Golden Girls friends out there, no, you're not mistaken. Blanche Devereaux was definitely named in honor of Blanche DuBois because they're both overheated Southern belles, former Southern belles. I think it's interesting, this production on Broadway that we said is Blanche's story, but Brando was so galvanizing. Brando just knocked everybody on their asses that it became really unbalanced. And it really did become the Marlon Brando show. So when they decided they wanted to make a film of it, because first of all, the show was a huge hit. Huge hit. It blew everything out of the water that season. But oddly, usually what happens when a play is a big hit, the movie studios come calling. And the movie studios did not come calling for A Streetcar Named Desire, mostly because this was the time of the production code. And these studio heads knew that there were just way too many things that went against the production code in this play.
One being Blanche's husband.
The first one being Blanche's husband. One of the big stumbling blocks is Blanche talks about her young husband who killed himself because she discovered him in bed with another man. So you right away have number one on the code. It's not number one, but you know what I'm saying. Sex perversion, homosexuality.
That went out the window.
So they had to deal with that. They also had to deal with. So basically, what happened was that 20th Century Fox passed. They're like, there's too many problems with this. We'll never be able to get a workable script out of this. And so it was actually Warner Brothers Jack Warner, who, for everything that people say about Jack Warner, took some big chances. He also brought Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf to the screen. So, I mean, Jack Warner was a ballsy guy. He said, we'll do this, but yes, we have to make some changes. So the production code said, you have to do something about the homosexual character. The rape scene. They said, the rape scene is okay, but make sure and this is what they said, make sure it's a tasteful rape. So you can have the rape in there, but just make sure it's tasteful.
Oh, God.
All right. And there was other language that they had to tone down in order to pass the production code. The script. We're just talking about before the movie's even shot. We're just talking about the hurdles they had to clear to even begin filming. By this time, Kazan had directed Gentleman's Agreement, had won an Oscar. He always wanted to just direct films, and he didn't like repeating himself. So they said, would you come back? Tennessee Williams said, would you please direct this film version of Streetcar? And Kazan at first said no. And then Tennessee Williams begged him, basically said, please, you have to protect me. And he trusted Kazan, that Kazan would protect him. Otherwise, he knew his play would be chopped to pieces. So Kazan said that he would come back to direct it primarily to help Tennessee Williams, and also because he was very unhappy with how the play became unbalanced on Broadway between Blanche and Stanley because of Brando. So he wanted to correct that balance and bring Blanche back into the forefront as much as possible to evenly balance the film out the way it was originally written.
Tony, I'm stopping our conversation real quick.
Why? Brett, we're in the middle of a podcast.
But this is about the podcast, and it's very important.
Okay.
Listener, whatever app you're listening on, whether it's on the computer or on the phone, reach your finger or your mouse over. It usually says follow. Some still say subscribe. And click that. And what's going to happen when they do that, Tony?
They're going to get notified when a new episode is available, and they can listen to us again. You don't want to miss that.
No.
Can we get back to the episode that we were recording?
Of course.
Please?
Of course.
All right. Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe and follow.
There you go. And talking about this film going from stage to film, there's something I really liked about this. A few weeks ago, we talked about The Boys in the Band.
Yeah.
And how it was a play, and then they made a movie out of it. And one of the downfalls of the movie was they were projecting too much like they were in the theater. They were theatrical.
Mm-hmm.
This movie was very similar that way, but it worked here, whereas it didn't work in The Boys in the Band. And I think for a couple of reasons. One, this, not that The Boys in the Band wasn't full of melodrama, but this was full of drama. So it didn't seem as much like they were overacting. These were people Stanley was awful, and there was just a lot of hurt and pain. The other thing is the set. It opened up with Blanche getting off of the Streetcar Named Desire, which really didn't run at that time period, but that's a whole different story.
Yeah, it was just bus lines, right? And it was a bus called Desire, but they didn't want to call it a bus line called Desire.
Right. So they got the city in New Orleans, let them use a car, and they put the Desire back on there, which, that's minor. I just thought it was funny.
Yeah.
Anyway, so she comes off of the streetcar, and then she goes to a bowling alley, I believe. But eventually, she may go to the house, but eventually when they get to the set, it's definitely not the nicest part of town, that's for sure. You see dancing girls and strip clubs and blah, blah, blah. But you see this courtyard of this apartment building that is not very nice. And the building, the way you can see the building and the way you can see the courtyard, it is like, oh, this is a theater set. And I knew right away, the only difference between this and what was in the theater is there's a wall there from when they go inside the building. That was, and I've never seen it on stage, but that was pretty obvious to me. Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely.
To me, it didn't hide the fact that this was original play. This is, to me, I was watching a play on film to a much different degree than The Boys in the Band.
Yeah,
and that's why it didn't bother me in that sense that Boys in the Band did.
I think that, like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, you had a cinema, although Vivien Leigh did a lot of theater. I mean, she was a classically trained actress. She was Lady Olivier, after all, married to Laurence Olivier, so they did a lot of theater. But Vivien Leigh was also a film-trained actress. She knew how to act in film. Hello, she played Scarlett O'Hara. Mm-hmm. So you had an actress who was very, very good at film acting, who was very adept at film acting. And you had Brando, this wasn't Brando's first film. Brando did a film called The Men a few years before. So this wasn't his first film, plus Brando was Brando. I mean, he brought his naturalism to this. That was what's so galvanizing about him on stage, was people had never seen a person behave this way. He behaved on stage just like people did in real life. And they were blown away by that. So that's why when you see A Streetcar Named Desire, you're not thinking, oh my God, this, I mean, yes, it does have the theatrical trappings. It's in one set or two sets, but that was the whole crux of Brando's acting genius, was it was like a real person walked in the stage with, I mean, he talks while he eats and he wipes his nose and it's people had never seen anything like this before. And when Kazan was first thinking about doing the film, he actually wanted to open it up. He actually wanted to make it more cinematic. That's what they call it. They call it opening up, when they take it outside of the confines of a stage set. And he actually thought about doing some scenes of Blanche's history at Belle Rive, which is the I guess it was a plantation, the plantation that she and Stella grew up on. And then he thought, a few weeks later, he thought better of it. He goes, no, best thing to do is just film the staged play. And so but he did add some scenes, as you mentioned, that were cinematic. Blanche's arrival in New Orleans. If you notice, the train comes in, it says New Orleans, and the train comes in, and we're at a train station, and Blanche appears through a puff of smoke, which is, which is such a brilliant shot. It's kind of like a throwback to Anna Karenina because that's how Anna Karenina in Tolstoy's book Anna Karenina appears through and she's a doomed character as well. So she appears like this unearthly creature through a puff of smoke. And Vivien Leigh had just filmed Anna Karenina a few years before, so it was like, I'm going through the smoke again. The puff of steam, actually, she appears through a puff of steam. And there's a short scene in the bowling alley when Blanche first arrives and she sees Stanley from afar and she sees Stella. And then there's the scene with Mitch later on in the film, which takes place on a pavilion. But other than that, it's on those two sets. And what's so genius about that is what's happening in this play when you really think about it. Blanche's life is closing in on her. It's more so, and so it makes a lot of sense that you would film it on this very close set. So the sense of claustrophobia, also the sense of the heat, the sweat, the sensuality, bodies up against each other fit so perfectly into the themes of this play. And I even read that as the play progressed and as they were filming it, that Kazan brought the sets in closer. He moved walls slightly closer to get that even more of a sense of Blanche's life closing in on her. And I just think it was because Kazan was such a talented film director, and this is such a talented cast, that they were able to bring that off and make it not seem like we're watching a play, like we're watching a film.
I heard about the closing walls things, and I got to tell, you don't notice it, but once I heard that, I'm like, oh my God, yes, because you just become increasingly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And at one point I thought, God, they seem really cramped. And they didn't seem really cramped in the beginning, but I never made that connection that they made the room smaller.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
It's so gradual. It's beautifully done.
Ingenious idea.
This set was absolutely beautiful. It is not a place you'd ever want to go.
No.
It was beautiful, and this place is grubby. The people are grubby. It is very real. And they won for best art direction.
Art direction, right.
Which I think is well deserved. Best art direction for a black and white film. Well deserved in my opinion.
Yes, it won for best art direction, black and white. And it was nominated for best cinematography, black and white. And I think it didn't win, but I think that it is beautifully shot.
Oh,
the whole film is beautiful from the first frame. It's so, the atmosphere just overwhelms you. You get that sense of the heat and the humidity. And then in comes this gorgeous animal named Stanley Kowalski, who just grabs your attention and doesn't let it go. And I want to talk a little bit about the differences between the two Blanches. And I think that Jessica Tandy, although I didn't see Jessica Tandy on stage, I'm not that old. From what I've read and what I've heard and what Brando has said, Brando preferred Vivien Leigh.
Oh, really?
I think that was because they were kindred spirits. They were both a little bawdy, a little crazy, and they kind of connected in that respect. And Jessica Tandy was she was a married woman. She was married to Hume Cronin for years and years and years.
1,000 years.
And she was, and Brando referred to her as the school teacher. And Blanche was a school teacher. So I think Jessica Tandy's version of Blanche was much more prim, much more proper, not quite as, again, this is speculation because I wasn't there. It wasn't quite the overheatedness that Vivien Leigh gives to it. Karl Malden preferred Jessica Tandy. He felt that Vivien Leigh was too sexy in it. And Vivien Leigh, just hold on to your phones for a minute. Vivien Leigh was only 37 when she made this film.
I know.
Okay. Think about that for a minute. She had just played Scarlett O'Hara 11 years before in 1939. So maybe 10 years because they shot this in 49. So 10 years before she was the ultimate femme fatale, Scarlett O'Hara. 10 years later, she's playing an over-the-hill woman whose life is over. I mean, it's insane.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. The reason I would have liked Jessica Tandy, and I didn't see the play, but I love Jessica Tandy as an actress. And the story with her and Hume, I just think is a Hollywood love story.
Yeah.
But anyway, my entire family, we laughed a lot, and we weren't supposed to be laughing because what we felt we were watching was Scarlett O'Hara has lost Tara,
yeah,
and she has fallen into madness.
Yeah.
And I could not shake that because that really is what it is, the way she played it, in my opinion.
It's incredibly meta. It's meta for the character of Scarlett O'Hara, because you had the ultimate Southern belle who a decade ago was, the most beautiful thing in the world. And now her life is falling apart 10 years later. Scarlett O'Hara was a lot stronger than Blanche DuBois. That's important to point out. Blanche DuBois, yes. Scarlett O'Hara, after all, tomorrow is another day. She'll never go hungry again. I mean, Scarlett O'Hara was much stronger, but you get that through line, which is another wonderful genius thing about casting Vivien Leigh. Vivien Leigh was obviously cast because she was a movie star. She was a name. And if you're going to have Brando, who had only made one film, if you're going to have Kim Hunter and Karl Malden, both from Broadway, who were not names, you need a name. And how fortunate that the name Vivien Leigh was available. It was not only available, Vivien Leigh wanted to do it. She played Blanche in London, directed by Laurence Olivier, directed by her husband, in preparation for doing the film. That's how much she wanted it, and that's how much she identified with it. It's also a very meta performance in the fact that Vivien Leigh said that Blanche was probably the role that tipped her over into madness. Being is that the strain of playing Blanche sent her past the limits of her own mental frailty. Vivien Leigh was famous, well, not famously now, but Vivien Leigh had a lot of mental instability. She had her first breakdown. She was bipolar, which, when we talked about Carrie Fisher, it's kind of interesting that we're also talking about another actress dealing with the disease of bipolar. And she had her first bipolar episode after she had a miscarriage. And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that pretty much a valid theory that very often mental illness is set on by a traumatic event creates the first set on of a mental illness?
Well, it's unknown what causes bipolar disorder, but it's believed to be hereditary. You're born with it. Mm-hmm. Not so great analogy as alcoholism, and maybe it's not so bad because substance abuse rate in people with bipolar disorder is much higher, as is the suicide rate, which is astronomically higher. People are predisposed with it. For example, if drinking heavily makes a person an alcoholic, everyone who went to college would be an alcoholic. That doesn't happen.
Right.
So bipolar disorder can't be cured, but it's treatable. And the general consensus is it's a chemical imbalance in the brain. And it can be more evident after a traumatic experience triggers it. Mm-hmm. I struggled with bipolar my entire life, and I didn't understand what was wrong until shit hit the fan in my life, and it became so prevalent, it was finally diagnosed. Thank God.
Yeah.
As for Vivien Leigh, I know women who showed more pronounced symptoms of the disease after childbirth.
Yeah.
So it is not uncommon.
The chemical imbalances of it. So the miscarriage, and then she became unstable for the rest of her life. It was a battle for her to hold on to her mind, and I think that playing Blanche after you've just had an experience like this, a terrifying experience, I'm sure, for her, and then to play a character which pretty much is going through a very similar situation. And she plays Blanche, I heard someone say that she plays Blanche without a safety net. This is a character who runs the gamut, who's in the extremes. And she plays it. She's so brave in her portrayal. She's so out there. She's so exposed. And for as strong as Scarlett O'Hara is, and as for as conniving as Scarlett O'Hara is, Blanche is also conniving, and Blanche is very deluded, however. And Scarlett O'Hara was never deluded. Scarlett O'Hara was a realist. So I think it's interesting that one character makes you think of the other, but when you really look at the two characters, they're totally different characters, played by the same actress in Oscar-winning performances.
Well, I think my husband worded it well. He said she was Scarlett O'Hara broken.
Yes.
And I think that's legit. And one thing I will give her to say that she was good in this role in a sense, Blanche, despite her station in life, she basically was trying to be Scarlett O'Hara.
Yeah.
She was trying to be something she was not. And maybe she was back when Belle Reve was around. I don't know. We really aren't told that, and I'm fine with that. I'm glad they didn't do the background. I like it being kind of mysterious and should stay that way. But maybe she was that Southern belle. that she was still trying to be, but she certainly was not.
Yeah, no, it's better off. It's better off left, I think, to our imagination. And Leigh does, Kazan preferred Tandy as well, he said, but he also said that Vivien Leigh really earned his respect. He felt that Vivien Leigh's performance had too much of Laurence Olivier in it, which, makes sense. She just did the play directed by Laurence Olivier. But that she was probably the gutsiest actress he ever worked with, that she would stop at nothing to get this performance right. And she really, really, he said, I think he said something about she would walk on glass to get this performance right. And you can sense that. And she did some amazing things. What I find impressive about her in this film, one of the things is how she uses her voice. She's got like 3 different registers of her voice. She's got her upper flirty range, when she first meets Mitch and she's being all coquettish with him. And then she's got her normal middle range, which is how she talks to Stella, primarily Stella, or another woman. And then, when she's in sadness and despair and anger, her register drops. And you really get the sense. I mean, it's this deep, longing voice. And I find it so I love technical stuff like that. I love, maybe it was because I was an actor, but I love seeing these actors be this technical. So you have this actress who is of the stage, of the British stage. Yes, she had done film, but of the British stage, very technical. And then you have this wild thing named Marlon Brando. And they come at each other in 2 different styles and 2 different ways of approaching a character. And, it's not just fireworks, it's cataclysmic when these 2 get together. And I think that's a great example of how these 2 different styles can really work. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it looks like people are in 2 different movies, but not in this. They hit each other and it's a cataclysm. And I think that's what gives this movie its energy and its fire, are these 2 people just bumping up against each other over and over again until one of them eventually breaks.
Their relationship feels very real and very sick.
Yeah.
And another thing I want to say, through most of the film, you do not see Blanche's face directly. It's shadowed, and you don't really know that, or at least I didn't notice it at all until the end.
Yeah.
When Karl Malden exposes her face.
Yeah.
After he finds out that she had this past, and he says, I want to see you. And she's begging him not to turn on the light.
Yeah.
And he does. When he turned on the light and you're looking at her face, that was when I'm like, we haven't seen her face really that much throughout this film until then.
No, it's true.
And they did a very good makeup job in making her look older. The wrinkles on the head were a little too much, but for the most part, they did a good job of making her look older. I was quite impressed. I was actually surprised to find out how young she was after I saw that.
That was definitely smart filmmaking, because they had to hide her face because she wasn't, she didn't look like this woman who's on her last, the last journey of her life. This is her last hope. How sad is that? This is her last hope. I think that's what hits me so emotionally about this film is that when you realize in the end, again, spoiler alerts for a 60-year-old movie. We forgot to mention that. So if you haven't seen Streetcar, when she's taken away to the asylum, it really hits you. You're like, oh my God, her life is over.
Oh yeah.
This was her last opportunity. Her sister was her last opportunity for a life. And Stanley just did, deliberate cruelty is the one unforgivable thing, she says. And he just, not only did he rape her, but he tipped her into madness. And now she's being thrown into an asylum, which God knows what's going to happen to her in an asylum. And then, at this time period. So it's really devastating.
And that deliberate cruelty line was excellent, because that's exactly what he was.
Oh, it's absolutely, yes. I think she says it to Mitch. I think she says, but that's definitely Stanley.
Yeah.
Stanley's definitely deliberate cruelty. I mean, there are lots of famous lines from this film. There's also, there's her famous last line is, I've always depended on the kindness of strangers, which many a drag queen has gotten a lot of distance out of that line.
Well, when I was younger, that could be so true for me, but that's a whole different story.
It could be true. It could be true for a lot of us. But what a brilliant line. She has so many wonderful lines. Tennessee Williams is Tennessee Williams. I mean, that's what he does. He writes these lines that are just butter in the mouths of these actors. I do want to talk a little bit about Brando. I think we need to talk a little bit about Brando and his persona and what, God, when you're watching him in this film, I think in this film more than any other, you just want to hate him, but you can't. And it's not just because he's so beautiful, because he is so beautiful, but Stanley this is what's so brilliant about Brando is Stanley, he's an animal, yes, but he's got a soft side. And I think this is the thing about Brando is Brando had this really intoxicating mix of male and female. He could be very soft and very quiet and then explode the next minute and be a brute. And I think if you look back in the history of really big movie stars, iconic movie stars, I'm thinking of people like Garbo. I'm even thinking of Judy Garland a little bit here. They had this mix of masculine and feminine, which makes them everybody. It doesn't just make them one thing. It makes them everybody. Everybody can identify. And with Brando, it's that. He's sweet and he's cruel. He has menace and he has humor. Stanley's very funny. That scene in the birthday party scene with the birthday cake, when he clears the table.
This is not my part's clean. You want me to help you clean yours?
And
it's terrifying and funny.
It's funny. I mean, it's menacing and terrifying, but it's funny. Yes, it's funny. He's like, let me help you clean yours. And he's got this beauty and this brutality. And that's what's so fascinating about Brando is that he brings that to every role, but never better and never more illustrated than in, this most iconic of his roles of Stanley Kowalski.
Well, and another thing I think they did beautifully, and this is Kim Hunter being spectacular, and I'm ashamed to say I didn't know Kim Hunter from anything other than Planet of the Apes.
Well, there's a good reason for that. I'll tell you when you're done.
The codependent relationship and this very dysfunctional relationship was so real. Two people that don't get along, they're like oil and water, but they need each other, and there's a passion. I don't know if I would call it love, but there is a passion.
Lust.
Yes. And I know they changed, well, who could blame him? But I know they changed the ending on that as well.
Yeah. But yeah, it's lust. How about that scene where the morning after, after the fight and after the whole Stella, and she comes down the stairs with that look of contempt / lust. And they go back to the bedroom and they just fuck all night. And she's laying there in bed. She has no clothes on, if you notice, when Blanche comes down. And she has that look on her face. And she says to Blanche, and Blanche says, he's like that streetcar named Desire that rattles up and down the street here. And she says, have you ever ridden that streetcar, Blanche? I mean, hello. That's right there.
That was a hot scene too.
Yeah, that's fabulous.
You see his back, and she's running arms up. Anyway.
I guess it doesn't surprise anybody that Marlon Brando worked out a little bit before he did this film.
Yes.
Because, wow. He didn't look that good on Broadway. I've seen pictures. I mean, he still looked great, but he worked out before he did this. So since we're talking about Stella and that scene after when he says Stella, when he's in the torn T-shirt, we should probably talk about some of the cuts, because that was one of the things. So what happened was that they had this film was made, done. They took all the suggestions that the Production Code Administration gave them, including cutting the homosexual references to Blanche's first husband. And there's actually a very funny story. So as I said, in the play, Blanche catches she tells us the story in the play. She catches her young husband with an older man in bed, and then later on he shoots himself. So they had to change that somehow, the homosexual illusion. So what they did was they euphemistically presented the young boy, when Blanche is talking about him, as a boy who was just too sensitive for life. He was a boy who wrote poetry. And Vivien Leigh allegedly said to Kazan, when she read this, she said, "You mean I have to say you disgust me because you write poetry?" But you get the idea. He's a sensitive boy who's just too sensitive for the world, and there's a lot of euphemisms, and so they took care of that whole homosexual character in there. They also softened the idea of Blanche getting kicked out of her hometown because of her promiscuity. She stated Tarantula Arms, she says in the restored version. The name, yes, I met many, many strangers, and Tarantula Arms like a spider was the hotel where she would have her assignations. The rape scene, as we discussed. So these things all passed the production code, and they thought they were home free. And then, what do you know?
The church.
Here comes the Catholic Church. Of course. Here comes the Legion of Decency. You may have gotten approval from the PCA, from the Production Code Administration, the Catholic Church said, but you didn't get it from us, and we're going to give you a C rating. Now, back in the days, a C rating from the Catholic Church meant condemned, which basically meant that priests could tell their congregation, you go watch this movie, you're going to hell. It was a mortal sin to see this movie. So that means no Catholic could see it under threat of eternal damnation. So they got a mediator together, one of the guys who originally wrote the code way back in the 30s, and they made some changes in the version. One of the changes was Stella's walk down the steps. After he yells Stella and she looks at him after they've had their fight, and she looks at him with that mix of contempt and lust, and she has just this carnal look on her face, like she's ready to tear her clothes off and tear his clothes off. And she does this long walk down the stairs, and it's a close-up. And the music is, talk about lascivious music. I mean, we have no doubt what's happening here. That was changed from a close-up to a long shot, and they changed the music to more violins, so it wasn't quite as blatant. They removed a couple lines, like Stanley has a line to Blanche at one point where he says, I would get ideas about you. And he kind of looks at her and she goes, what do you mean? And he goes, you know what I mean. So that was cut. That's in the restored versions.
In today's world, that's hard to imagine that was taboo.
Yeah, I know, right? I mean, who cares? But she also cut the line I just said about, I have had many meetings with strangers. So that was cut. So there was they cut about 4 minutes. And the Catholic Church was like, okay. Oh, there was one more scene. There's a scene with a newspaper boy in which Blanche asks him,
Yes, I was going to ask you about that, if there was more to it.
Yes. Well, you probably saw the restored version. I mean, I'm not sure which version you saw, but the restored version, it's a scene right before Mitch comes to take Blanche away, and she's reminiscing about her in her mind. She's having an episode.
Yes, I saw the restored version.
And so the newspaper boy comes to collect for the paper, and he's this young, good-looking kid, and she requests to kiss him softly on the mouth just once. And that got laughs when it was in previews. So they recut it to make him less prominent, which I don't know why it was getting laughs. I think it's a beautiful scene. And you get the real longing in this woman for her.
It's sad on her part.
The life of beauty that she lost.
You could tell she's longing to be young.
Longing to be young and longing for her life that she had at Belle Reve, which is gone with the wind. Anyway, so these scenes were miraculously, once again, another miracle. We talked about Babyface miraculously showing up in the Library of Congress. Well, these cut scenes miraculously showed up in an unmarked box. And we're like, oh, these are the scenes that were cut from A Streetcar Named Desire. So they're back in now. And most versions that you see now, I believe, is the restored version. And the easiest way to tell is just look for Stella's walk. And if Stella looks like she's ready to rip into a T-bone steak and the music is indicating it, then you're watching the restored version.
And I have a question about the paper boy. First of all, I think it was hysterical that he's there to collect for the newspaper and he's wearing a suit. Maybe that was common at that time, but I got a kick out of that.
Different time.
But I was curious. I felt like there was more to it than just the kiss. Because in the movie, she kisses him and he goes away.
There's not more to it. It's just that it's what he brings up in her.
Yes.
You know what I mean? She's talking, she's obviously thinking about her dead husband. She just had this, that's probably what, in the psychology of this character, and I didn't go too deeply into the psychology of Blanche DuBois because I don't want to lose my mind. But in the psychology of this character, I'm sure he tripped off a memory in her mind of her young husband, because not too much long after this, she tells Mitch the story of her young husband, the young boy who killed himself, as she calls him. So there wasn't more. I think that that's the purpose of it. I think the purpose of it, and this is just my interpretation, is to kick her into that reverie about her husband so we can find out about that.
And it was quite obvious. It did a good job of showing that she was trying to regain her youth through this boy.
Yes. Well, she's Blanche DuBois. Blanche DuBois has become a catchphrase for fading Southern belles. That's why we got Blanche Devereaux. Yeah. It's all you need is that one, even Blanche. Just say Blanche and people know you're talking about a faded Southern belle.
Yeah.
These characters are they're mythic. They've been played by every actor and every actress. I mean, we're talking about Jessica Lange. I heard Amy Ryan did it. I saw Anne Margaret do it with Treat Williams. I mean, it's Tennessee Williams, so people want to play these characters. It's also been reinterpreted. Do you remember that movie Blue Jasmine that was out a couple years ago that Woody Allen did?
No, I don't.
With Cate Blanchett. She won Best Actress.
Don't remember that at all.
Remember that movie? There were definite, watch it. It's a very good movie. I mean, if you can tolerate Woody Allen films, watch it. It's a very good movie. And
I like his older stuff, and
it's very good. Blue Jasmine is one of his better, more recent films. I mean, we're still talking, I think, over 10 years ago, but Cate Blanchett won an Oscar for it, and it's got definite Streetcar Named Desire allusions to it. So, I mean, there's that. It was played by Tallulah Bankhead, who was one of the inspirations for Blanche, actually did a production of this in the mid-50s that turned kind of comical, which is very sad. It was very sad for Tallulah, and it was very sad for Tennessee Williams, because she had become such a caricature then that people were laughing when she would say these lines. So that's unfortunate.
Oh, that's sad.
But I mean, Uta Hagen, Rosemary Harris, just the list goes on. Gillian Anderson played Blanche, and there have been Stanleys, Blair Underwood. I remember not too long ago there was a all black production of Streetcar, and Blair Underwood played Stanley. So people want to play these characters. I mean, they're iconic characters, but I just don't think, how can you possibly touch Brando and Leigh? I mean, it's everything. It's everything.
Yeah, it's amazing. And you talk about iconic characters. I need to point out iconic lines, which you named them already. But my husband, who has never seen this movie, when Stella is upstairs in the apartment and Stanley you see the angst that he has in his face. They show close-up of his face. And Maurice goes, "Here it comes. Here it comes." And he goes, "Stella." And Maurice goes, "Yes, there, he said it."
Yeah.
He knew right away. And then at the end, when she said, "I've always relied on the kindness of strangers," he was like, "I've been waiting the whole movie for that line."
It's her last line. That's why you were waiting for it. Yeah, talking about the Stella thing, I always thought it had to be overrated. And then just watching it again recently, I was like, it's not overrated. He is unbelievable when he yells Stella. You get all of that from him. You get all of that fear he has that he's lost her. You get that desire for her. You get, I mean, everything in that. That's why it's iconic, because it's so fucking good when he does it. It's full of everything in Stanley.
You can define the passion in many, many, many ways, but you can't argue that was a passionate scream for Stella.
Oh, it's from the depths of his soul. And then when he drops to his knees and he's like a little boy and he's crying, and she wraps her arms around him and then kind of digs her nails into his back. You get their relationship. You understand why she's with him. You also understand, I should point out one other important change to the script that I forgot to mention is that after the tasteful rape that has pushed Blanche into madness, and Stanley and it's alluded to that Blanche has been telling Stella what Stanley did and that nobody believes her, which also chips her into madness, and then she's taken away. Stella realizes that Blanche was telling the truth, and she does not go back to Stanley. She says to her baby, "We're not going in there. I'm never going back in there again." And she goes upstairs, and that's where the movie ends. The play doesn't end that way. The play ends with her going back with Stanley.
Yeah.
So they felt that there had to be some kind of repercussions for this heinous act that Stanley did. And that was one way of, quote unquote, punishing the bad guy, was having Stella leave him. Now, I don't know how long she says, "I'm never going back in there again," but we've clearly seen her willpower when Stanley's there with a torn t-shirt ain't all that strong. But that was an interesting change that they made. So I think the legacy of this film to acting, clearly, this film, Brando's performance in this film, changed screen acting forever. From then on, you had the old actors and you had the new method actors. In an entire generation, even up to my generation. I mean, I studied Stanislavski. I studied the method. That's what you do now. And, from Brando to James Dean to Paul Newman to George Papard, for Christ's sake, to James Caan to Al Pacino to Robert De Niro, this is all because of this one actor's titanic performance. So I don't think you can overstate the effect of Brando in this film.
I agree.
And that's it.
Are we done?
I think we're done. Tony!
Can I tell you one thing, though, Brad?
Sure.
Never let him see you ache. That's what Mr. Mayer used to say.
Oh, I wear my heart on my sleeves.
Or is it ass? Never let him see your ass. Unless it's Marlon Brando's.
Well, I don't have the ass I had when I was 25, so I don't know if that's a problem.
Thank you, everybody, for rating us, for reviewing us, for listening. I hope you're listening to our Spotify playlist. It's a beautiful score by Alex North from this film. Please subscribe, rate, review us. Let us know what you think. Text us. Let us know if you'd like. If there's a movie you want us to talk about.
And I didn't tell how to do that.
You didn't? Tell the people.
There's two good ways to do that. First of all, the fun way would be to go to the website, goinghollywoodpodcast.com, and there's a little microphone on there that you can click on and actually leave a message that we can play for you on the show. But if you don't want to do that, you can just send an email to goinghollywoodpodcast@gmail.com. Let us know either way what you think, or if you have any suggestions, or both.
It'd be great to hear from you all. Thanks for listening.
Ta-ta.